Is vitamin A actually a poison, and how likely is it that you're dealing with vitamin A toxicity? We'll be answering these questions in today's episode of the Energy Balance Podcast, a podcast where we explore health and nutrition from the bioenergetic view and teach you how to maximize your cellular energy to maximize your health. In today's episode, we'll be going over the research behind vitamin A toxicity and whether vitamin A is really a poison. We'll be discussing whether you need to be concerned about the use of Accutane. We'll also go over whether retinoic acid is really a chemotherapeutic agent and what this might mean. And we'll talk about whether Grant Genereux's claims about the toxicity of vitamin A are valid. This is our second episode discussing some of these claims. In the last one, we talked a bit more about vitamin A deficiency. So you can go ahead and take a look at that one as a starting place. As always, to check out the show notes for today's episode, you can head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/podcast, where I'll link to the studies, articles, and anything else that we reference throughout today's episode. And with that, let's get started. All right. So in the last episode, we were talking through kind of an overview of some of the vitamin A toxicity ideas, and then we dug into some studies discussing vitamin A deficiency and the claims made by Grant Genereux in his book, Poisoning for Profits. And today we're going to be continuing that series, second part of that series, and we'll be going over, in this case, more of the focus on vitamin A toxicity. Again, mostly focusing on claims made by Grant Genereux in his book, Poisoning for Profits, and we'll be including some specific quotes and going over some of the studies that he cites in particular. It is worth mentioning as a disclaimer as we get started here, there's going to be some sort of provocative title and thumbnail on the episode, and for anyone listening who's coming from the vitamin A toxicity crowd, we will be challenging a lot of those beliefs, but our goal here is just to look at this objectively, evaluate the claims that are made, and help you to identify if this is something you should actually be considering as a possible health issue and what to do about it. So we have no goal here other than that. There's no, we talked about this in the last episode. We went into reading Grant's book and, his blog and listening to his interviews, looking to gain information, looking to consider this as a possibility and, figure out where on the spectrum this might be in terms of how much it might affect our health and whether we should be concerned about vitamin A toxicity or deficiency. And that's the extent of it. So we don't have any other dog in this fight and are just trying to provide good quality, objective information for all of you. So if you are coming from that crowd, I would highly recommend trying to kind of take a step back, take a deep breath, and see if you can, look through the different citations that we have, the studies we discuss, and listen through what we're suggesting objectively. And it's worth mentioning as well, we're not discounting the experiences of anybody on a low vitamin A diet. There's a lot of reasons why someone might have benefits on that diet. We'll talk a little bit about that in today's episode. And then we also will be in some future episodes discussing details of retinol and retinoids and their metabolism and their relationship with thyroid health and other hormones and metabolic health and nutrients and all the ins and outs there. We'll really be getting into that in these couple of episodes. Instead, we're just trying to dig into some of the real basic, fundamental, foundational claims in the vitamin A toxicity world. And one other kind of intention that we have had here in this series is just to also provide an example of looking at other people's thought processes and the kinds of theories that they're proposing and examining them as far as how logical they are and the support that's used and whether, and kind of to use it almost as an example of why we should be really careful in evaluating anybody's claims and shouldn't take anything that somebody says for, on face value and integrate it, instead we want to integrate it into our view of physiology and try to really understand those claims to the extent that we can so we can evaluate if they actually are solid arguments and if we want to make changes based on what someone's suggesting. So ideally it'll be a good practice in terms of kind of critical thinking and exploration of some possibly alternative ideas. So Mike, is there anything else you want to mention before we dig in here?
No, I think you covered the vast majority of the points that I would want to discuss to open the episode up.
Okay, awesome. Well, with that, let's dig into some of Grant's claims in regard to hypervitaminosis A, which is basically vitamin A toxicity. And his general claim in his book is basically that vitamin A toxicity occurs at relatively low doses in vivo studies. And so this is something that could be happening in anybody, and we need to be careful of it because of that. And so in this section, we'll be going through some of the quotes and studies in the subheading in his book titled Vitamin A Toxicity is Proven in Vivo. A couple other things to note before we dig into the research here. So just like in the last episode, we're going to be using beef liver equivalents for vitamin A dosing, just because it makes it a lot easier to conceptualize. If we're talking about thousands or even millions of IUs or micrograms of retinol, it's hard to conceptualize what that could mean. And so we'll be converting it to beef liver equivalents. The reason for that is because beef liver is basically by far the most concentrated form of retinol that the average person or average health-oriented person might consume. And it's way more than any other, or the vast majority of other sources of retinol or other retinoids or carotenoids. So as an example, 1 ounce of beef liver is typically, in terms of retinol, the equivalent of about 40 eggs, 71 cups of milk, 6.5 carrots, and around 2.8 sweet potatoes. And with the carrots and sweet potatoes, that's using an equivalence between retinol and beta carotene based on an assumption of kind of absorption and conversion. But in any case, we're talking about very large amounts of these other foods, and we'll be talking about very large amounts of beef liver equivalents here when it comes to some of these studies. So it'll just help you recognize really one of the main points that we'll be getting at, which is that you're never going to accidentally consume these amounts of vitamin A or retinol. They're so massive, these amounts that we'll be talking about, that the likelihood that someone could accidentally induce vitamin A toxicity in the way that they're doing in these studies is nearly impossible. It really is impossible. So that's it'll help with that kind of conceptualization. The other thing that's worth mentioning here is that Grant almost makes it sound as though the fact that hypervitaminosis A or vitamin A toxicity exists is support for the likelihood of this being an issue for a lot of people. And nobody that I know of, including us, disagrees with the fact that hypervitaminosis A exists. Basically, you can consume enough vitamin A to cause toxic effects. This is something that's been known for nearly 100 years. We'll be digging into some of the studies done throughout this time. But the fact that consuming or taking massive amounts of vitamin A is toxic doesn't mean that you need to avoid foods containing vitamin A. It doesn't mean that you are going to become vitamin A toxic just by consuming foods that are relatively high in retinol consumption, or retinol amounts or concentrations. And it's also worth noting that this is the case for pretty much any vitamin or mineral or nutrient or intervention that you can think of. You can overdo it to the point where it becomes toxic and kills you. Everything from even the most benign, something like water, if you drink too much of it, you'll die. You'll drown. And it's not even that much. You can have major issues from drinking the amount of water that you would typically drink in 2 days. If you drink that in an hour, you could die from that. So it's not like it even needs to be in insane doses, but of course that doesn't mean that water is toxic. It doesn't mean that drinking water is going to then cause seizures or brain swelling or a coma or death, just because very large doses in a short period of time will do so. So, the same thing can be said for sodium. Again, it's one of those things where if you consume too much in a short period of time, same thing can happen. It's also the same for other interventions. So whether we're talking exercise or sunlight, just because too much of these things can be really, really harmful. If you were to sit out in the sun with all of your skin exposed, and it's, you're at the equator and you're out in the sun all day and you get severe first, second, third degree burns, that doesn't mean that sunlight is toxic or harmful. It just means that too much is toxic or harmful. And so that's just like a concept to be familiar with when it comes to somebody making a claim like the idea that because there is vitamin A toxicity, vitamin A is toxic, vitamin A is a poison. And of course, just two other quick examples, and then I'll let you go ahead, Mike. One would be stress hormones like cortisol or adrenaline. We obviously need them. If you don't have them, then that's a potentially lethal condition. But too much of them is also a lethal condition. If you administer too much epinephrine to someone, they'll die as well. So That doesn't mean inherently that adrenaline or epinephrine is toxic. It's just that we have a certain need for it and we don't want to have too much or too little. And there's so many details to go into there, but just because too much is a problem, that does not mean that any amount is a problem. Same thing with thyroid hormones. If you were to give somebody huge quantities of T3 all at once, they can also die. That doesn't mean we don't want any T3. It doesn't mean T3 is toxic. It doesn't mean it doesn't have many beneficial effects. It doesn't mean that a lack of T3 is not going to cause various health issues. So those are just some things to mention when it comes to looking at studies on the toxicity of vitamin A.
I think there's a couple points in there that I want to touch on that I think would be salient here. So the first one is, even some of the substances that are promoted inside the low vitamin A camp, things like niacin, can be pretty toxic pretty quickly at certain dosages, particularly for the liver. You start getting into gram dosages of the vitamin, which is relatively equivalent to what they're doing in these studies with hypervitaminosis A, where they're getting ridiculous doses of vitamin A. And then the thing is, the researchers aren't saying, look, vitamin A is toxic. Grant is saying, look, vitamin A is toxic. And the thing is like, yes, Grant, it is toxic at these ridiculous dosages that we're seeing. So the second piece from there is the argument that's getting made is that vitamin A, since it is fat soluble, is cumulatively toxic. And the thing is that the case? Yes, but we also do understand the threshold for cumulative toxicity that comes out of the research. So it's pretty clear where people can start to develop toxicity over a number of years. And the dosages look to be, the dosages look to be greater than about 25,000 IU per day. At least that's what's been set by some of the regulating bodies or some of the research. So we're seeing, we know that yes, it can accumulate, but we also, knowing that it can accumulate, have kind of set thresholds and targets to say, okay, at what point do we start to have concerns about cumulative toxicity? And when we start to look at that, we start to say, okay, it's probably somewhere greater than 10,000 IUs per day for a number of years, and we're looking more like 25,000 to 40,000 IU per day over this extended period of time, which leads me into the next point. So there's been the title of the book is Poisoning for Profits. And there's this perspective that's generated that the regulating bodies in these different groups are actually just trying to poison people with vitamin A for some profit motive. And the thing is, when you look at the actual targets set, like the RDA, the recommended dietary allowances, basically they're extremely low. Like it's somewhere for fully grown adults, somewhere between 900 micrograms of retinol activity equivalents. So basically, that's converting beta carotene into an equivalent dose for retinol, because they're not the same. And then the tolerable upper intakes were set at 3,000 micrograms per day. And so within that range, what they're basically saying is, this is the amount that we need to prevent deficiency, which we already established in the last video can indeed occur for humans. And then here's the level where we think that it's probably not, there's not really a massive benefit to going higher than that in most cases. And there could be some problems. And then even within that research, they start to say, okay, well, maybe it's about 25,000 or 40,000 IUs per day for a number of years or months to years. And then there's also these points of the modifying factors, your liver function. Are you drinking alcohol? Are you eating enough protein? And intake of certain things like vitamin D and things like this. So it's not like there's this conspiracy to poison people with vitamin A. The doses that have been set are quite low with accumulation information in mind. And then we also know that there's modifying factors. So I think it's a bit of a fallacious argument to try to set it up as two camps, and that people are being poisoned with this for profits, especially to then cite the studies that Grant cites here to show toxicity. Because as we'll see in just a couple minutes, the dosage used in the toxicity studies are insane. And especially when you consider the lifespan of a rat, which we talked about in the previous video, is when you start to look at equivalent time frames in humans, it's ridiculously high dosages for the equivalent of years, which is what is known already. So it's the Grant is presenting this perspective as if there's this conspiracy to poison people with vitamin A. And it's like that's not really the case when you start to go through the research, when you start to look at what is excretion, what is metabolism, what is storage, what is utilization of the vitamin, and then also look at the studies that he's trying to use to cite for toxicity. So this is I think that we have to get rid of this idea that it's poisoning for profits, that people are just being poisoned by vitamin A from these guidelines. We understand that there's a cumulative effect because it is fat soluble, but the researchers also know that. And so there's also been an understanding that there's a window where it's too much and when there's not enough. And then besides that, like, as you pointed out, Jay, almost every single substance at certain dosages will create different problems. So it's a logical fallacy to go ahead and say, oh, if this is toxic at this dose, then it just must be toxic. So this is the component. So we established that there is a requirement for it. It's not just like this thing that's present in our food that's purely a toxin. Like, we know that we have some need for it. We talked about that in the past video. And now what we're going to talk about here, the second point, which is Grant's major point, is that it accumulates and becomes toxic. It's like, at what threshold is that? And it's like, there's actually quite a bit of room before you start to get significant toxicity. And once you eliminate these two perspectives, the entire vitamin A toxicity thing from the low vitamin A camp kind of goes out the window. And so is this poisoning for profits idea. It doesn't mean that vitamin A is not toxic at certain dosages, but it means this perspective that is being pushed based on the research and the information we have is just there's no perspective here. Basically, this perspective does not line up with reality, especially because we just in the past video we destroyed the deficiency piece, and now we're going to destroy the toxicity piece from this perspective.
Definitely. And two real brief things I want to mention, and then we'll get into the study. So firstly, as you were highlighting from Grant's book, there's this idea put forth that basically the governing bodies are trying to poison you, the pharmaceutical companies are trying to poison you. So, those limits that they set and the recommendations that they set, those should be totally thrown out the window. As you're saying, Mike, they're actually pretty well supported. But also, if that's the case, then the studies cited by Grant would need to suggest something vastly different from that. And as we'll get into, they don't. So that's the first thing. The second is that as we get into some of these studies and look at the different dosing that they're using, really, if anything, it will end up supporting how safe vitamin A is in absolutely insane doses relative to what anybody would normally eat. Looking at the levels in the blood and the liver, really there's very little toxicity until you get to even more insane doses. And well, as we kind of get into the numbers here, you'll see that it's probably really, really hard to create vitamin A toxicity even if you try, it'd be really, really difficult unless, again, you're using a medication that's particularly highly dosed, like, you're using it for cancer or something, but we'll get into that in a bit. So,
yeah, even then, you basically, I think the biggest point here is because the concern I see, because I have clients asking me, they're like, oh, should I stop? Like, should I not have liver? Should I not eat eggs? Should I not have butter because it has vitamin A? And then my answer is pretty much, you shouldn't stop eating those things unless you specifically have a problem from eating those things, or you have a past where you took insane doses of vitamin A and then have developed a cumulative toxicity from insane doses. But with that said, the way that you would do that, you would either have to be using some type of liver source in very high amounts, including cod liver oil or beef liver, or you would have to be taking vitamin A dosages in very high amounts as well, or you'd have to be using pharmaceutical retinoid derivatives. So unless you are somebody who highly dosed vitamin A, and something to consider is that's modifiable by other fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin D, the toxicity threshold adjusts. Unless you're somebody who's taking extremely high doses of vitamin A and or liver and or pharmaceuticals, the idea that you are vitamin A toxic is a bit tenuous. And so when I'm working with a client, I'm trying to gauge what is their past history and use of some of these things, and then and then basically run from there. And then with a lot of these animal studies, if you just stop the high dosages of some of these things over time, the animals will recover from it. And then even in the human case studies where people have taken insanely high dosages and actually really damaged their liver, they still recover after that once they cease taking the vitamin A. So I think it's what is your context? In most normal circumstances, this is unlikely to be an issue. And then if your context is reasonable and it reasonably fits this background where you took really high doses of vitamin A for a long time for whatever the particular reason is and whatever the form is, then stop. And then the other thing is make sure you're eating enough protein. I wouldn't drink a lot of alcohol. Maybe start to consume adequate amounts of zinc and vitamin D to kind of help offset whatever's going on and then run from there. And then the liver function, these other components should improve over time from that. So I think that's a very small case of people. And to the argument that we see here that everybody's just vitamin A toxic, I don't think we're really going to see that, especially when we start talking about the actual dosages that are needed to cause toxicity inside the animal studies.
As you were saying there's a lot of things to consider in terms of things that could predispose us to vitamin A toxicity. We'll be digging into those more in our future episodes, discussing some of the details here and talking about how hypothyroidism or a lack of certain vitamins or minerals, as you were discussing, could predispose us to having, quote, vitamin A toxicity at a lower dose. But again, that's outside the scope of what we're going into here. We will kind of talk about that later on. In either case, still something that's not particularly likely to occur. Again, that doesn't mean you can't feel better on a low vitamin A diet. There's a lot of reasons why you could feel better. We'll talk about that as well. And the last point that you mentioned that I do think is worth highlighting because it's pointed out in these studies, and it was in the previous studies in the opposite way, which is basically that recovery from vitamin A toxicity is pretty quick in these studies. And this is intense, severe toxicity. So again, the idea that this is going to be something where once you're vitamin A toxic, it's going to take you many, many years until you're feeling any better is, these studies alone put that into question without digging into any further details. So with that, we're going to dig into two of the studies that Grant cites for support for hypervitaminosis A occurring in relatively low doses in vivo. And again, there's really only two in vivo studies that he cites, so we're going to dig into each of those. But I do want to mention before we dig into the first one that I'm assuming that if you're listening to this and you're interested in vitamin A toxicity, it's likely because you're dealing with lasting chronic health issues. And when it comes to determining the optimal diet for resolving these issues, there's a lot of conflicting information out there. So if you're looking to optimally support your metabolism, lose weight, improve your digestion, get amazing sleep, rebalance your hormones, boost your energy, and recover from various other chronic health issues, and if you'd like to have clear action steps and strategies alongside personalized guidance from me, then head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/solution, where you can find all of the information for the Energy Balance Solution program. This program includes customized health coaching, a video library with videos on how to restore gut health, how to regulate blood sugar, how to lose weight without destroying your metabolism, how to get amazing restorative sleep, how to rebalance your hormones, and tons more. It also includes resources like sample meal plans and a supplement guide, as well as a private community. So again, head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/solution to check out all the details. All right, so digging into this first study here, Grant has a quote saying, "I like this statement from their abstract," and he then quotes their abstract, which says, "Rats were fed on massive doses of vitamin A for periods varying from 10 to 18 days. Grant then states, "Then in the experimental details section of the report, they define exactly what massive means. It is 1 drop of halibut liver oil per rat per week. Therefore, for these rats, that's a whole 3 or 4 drops of halibut liver oil in their entire lifetime. That's all that was needed to induce serious disease and bone fractures." So in this quote from Grant, he's referencing a study titled The Action of Vitamin K in Hypervitaminosis A from 1947. And as he said in that study, they use halibut liver oil, and halibut liver is extremely concentrated in vitamin A, far more so than beef liver and most other livers. It's one of the most concentrated. And each gram of halibut liver oil contains 40,000 IUs of retinol. Well, this is a lot. We're talking about a very, very concentrated vitamin A dose. We're also talking about very small rats that weigh as little as 85 grams, so less than a quarter of a pound, and are pretty young as well. So it's not like, when we think of a drop of even a very concentrated vitamin A source, the idea that that could cause toxicity sounds a little crazy, but the concentration of in this case, supplement needs to be noted, as well as the size of these animals, right? A quarter of a pound versus, let's say, an average human at 150 pounds, we're talking about a 600 times difference. So that's all worth considering. Now, we'll get into some of the details here as well, but it's worth noting the study was from quite a while back, and they never actually controlled for the exact dosing. They never actually measured the exact amount of vitamin A that was given, and they never stated that dose. They did state they used 1 drop of this oil. Typically, 1 drop is about 0.05 grams. So for a 40,000 IU per gram concentrated oil in the halibut liver oil, that would be about 2,000 IUs or 600 micrograms of retinol. This is still not a small amount. So for an 85 gram rat, which some of the rats that were used were 85 grams, I believe, and then others were 153, or maybe the 153 grams was later on in the study. In any case, those were kind of the 2 weights given. For an 85 gram rat, this is a human equivalent dose of 1,150 micrograms per kilogram, which for an average weight human, again, 70 kilograms or 150 pounds, that's around 80,000 micrograms, or the equivalent of 27 ounces of beef liver. So this is still a massive dose of
that
retinol.
Is per week, right, Jay? That's 27 ounces of beef liver per week.
Exactly. Yeah. So not something you're going to do accidentally. That's for sure. And then for the 153 gram rat, so it's a little bigger, getting the same dose presumably, then it would end up being a lower dose of around 635 micrograms per kilogram for a human equivalent dose, which comes out to about 44,500 micrograms for a 70 kilogram human. And that's the equivalent of 15 ounces of beef liver per week. So these are still large doses. It's not like this is a small dose of retinol at all, but it also doesn't seem like they used that dose, because when you then look at the concentration of retinol in the liver, and the total amount of retinol in the liver, when you're looking at the rat groups given this 1 drop versus the controls, the concentration was about 60 times the controls, and the total retinol amount was 55 times the controls. So pretty large amounts, and we'll be going through a study later that actually does provide the exact dosing used in a much more accurate and precise way than just a drop of some concentrated oil. And we see how much retinol ends up in the liver in those studies. And essentially, the dosing here does not at all correlate with those other studies. So, yeah, basically, in these other studies, if you were to compare the very similar amounts of retinol in I think what it is, and we'll get into it later, is that in this other study, they use 70 times this presumed dose. So 70 times this 2,000 IUs. And there is less retinol content in the liver in those other studies. So the dosing provided in this experiment doesn't seem accurate. It doesn't seem like we're getting the full picture. They didn't even measure or provide the exact dosing given. So there's a lot of question marks here. And it doesn't at all fit with all of the other vitamin A toxicity data. Again, either way, it's worth pointing out it's still a very large dose, but in the other studies that are using way higher doses, it doesn't fit with those at all.
Yeah, I think there's a couple, for me, when I went through that study, there's a couple key takeaways for it. And essentially, one is that they don't really list out the methods very well, but it's from 1947. So the standardization, the standardized practice in terms of writing out methods into sections for studies aren't the same as they are now. And so essentially it says the only information we know is the rats get 40,000 IUs per gram of halibut liver oil, and they get 1 drop, and 1 drop is not weighed. So we don't actually know how much of this vitamin A they're getting. So you estimated it based on what a typical drop would be, and that gave you 2,000 IUs per week. But when we actually look at the concentration of vitamin A or retinol inside the liver, it doesn't match up with the concentration that we see in other studies that give much higher dosages. So we actually, in fairness to Grant's perspective, chose the lower dose here. And even choosing the lower dose here, out of trying to be as fair as possible from the perspective, it's still between 1 to 2 pounds of beef liver per week. And the other thing is the 2 pound beef liver dosage per week is in young animals, which are more susceptible, which would be more susceptible to the toxicity of vitamin A. And that's in a human equivalent dosages. So that'd be the equivalent of 1 or 2 pounds of beef liver per week. So 2 pounds for a child and 1 pound for an adult, essentially, or 1 pound for like like an adolescent, middle, like not a fully grown adult, but like an older human. And so basically, even with that, it's still a massive dose of retinol, but based on the liver concentrations, and the reason we're looking at liver concentrations is because vitamin A is mainly stored in the liver inside the body. So based on the liver concentrations that they did report in this study, what we're basically assuming is that the dose is actually probably closer to maybe 40,000 IUs per week or something much higher than what we see at the 2,000, which would make that human equivalent dose for liver significantly higher than 1 or 2 pounds a week, like by a multiple factor. So with this said, the data, you could say, oh, well, here, this is relatively lower dose for this study. But then when you look at the liver concentration, it's like, well, it depends on where you're estimating the dose, and we don't really know. We don't actually know the exact dose, but based on liver concentrations, it's much higher than was given. So this study is basically showing us, again, what we've already discussed. Even if we take the lowest possible considerable reasonable dose, we're still looking at a very high amount of retinol per week, on the order of 1 to 2 pounds of liver per week for a human, which in most circumstances, that wouldn't be recommended. Even in people who tend to favor vitamin A, like Dr. Pete or people like Dr. Chris Masterjohn, there's not a recommendation to eat 1 to 2 pounds of beef liver per week. And by the standard governing bodies, that's definitely not a recommendation. And I think that invalidates just this alone, and we're starting with this study because this is the lowest possible dose. That alone invalidates this idea of poisoning for profits, right? Because the dosage here is insane. And when we get to the next dosages, it's like, it's not even a question. Like, it's not even going to be a question anymore when we start talking about what the equivalencies are. So this was probably the closest chance that Grant had to justify this toxicity. And it's not really great support, essentially. Like this study, we're using his study, and it's not supporting his point.
Yeah, and again, it's one thing if these same doses and the same liver retinol concentration and these same effects were seen in all the later studies, in the past 70 plus years, and this was replicated, but it's not at all replicated. And as we'll talk about in that other one of the other studies we'll go through, they were using, instead of 2,000 IU per week, they were using 161,000 IU per week, and they still only ended up with a liver content of 21 times what the controls were, whereas in this study it was 55 times. So the dosing here is not lining up. It is not replicated in future studies. Even if this was accurate, it would still be very large amounts of retinol. But what we actually find is it takes way more. This study cannot be valid. It doesn't at all fit in with the other studies on vitamin A toxicity. Of course, other than the fact that we just don't know the dosing. So you could say it's valid, but maybe they just dosed way more than they said they did. And there was, again, the methods weren't clear, as you were saying. This was done very early on. So yeah, that's as far as this study can take us. When we look at other studies cited by Grant and some other studies that are worth looking at, we see that this doesn't hold up.
When I went through it myself, my assumption was they're telling me 40,000 IU per gram because they're probably just giving the rats a gram, because they're saying, oh, we give them a 1 drop per week. It's like, that literally doesn't mean anything. Like, how many grams is a drop in this circumstance, again, in 1947? and
Right.
it's not very clear. And then with the liver concentration, again, it's like this is probably much higher than the estimated dose that we're running with. And then if indeed it is, which it seems like it very likely is, then basically what we're looking at is it's in line with the rest of the studies that you need really high dosages of vitamin A to start to cause toxicity problems. So for me, it's like this. Yeah, we're seeing really high dosages still. Even from the lowest dose to the highest dose that you could run with, there's no way around the fact that it's a ridiculous amount of vitamin A that the vast majority of people are not consuming.
Right. Right. And in the next study Grant cites, we're seeing these kinds of doses, the ones that are way, way higher, 70 times higher in this case than that first study. And again, this is cited by Grant. So I'm going to read his quote, and then Mike, I'll let you go ahead. So Grant then has a quote here, and he includes a quote from a study that we'll dig into titled Concerning the Toxicity of Vitamin A. He states, very similarly from an earlier study from 1937, we have, and then he states that quote, and he says, the rats were fed 0.5 cc daily or a dosage of 20,000 units of vitamin A. The outstanding features of the disease produced in about 10 days were failure to grow, inflammatory changes in the eyes with exophthalmos, and changes in the bones resulting in spontaneous fractures. And he states this as if it's supporting his point, which in this case, he's talking about how the symptoms of vitamin A toxicity are similar to the symptoms of vitamin A deficiency. So kind of operating on the assumption that these are actually symptoms of deficiency and these rats are deficient, that in the prior studies looking at deficiency, the rats were actually dealing with excess vitamin A. But we already talked about that pretty thoroughly in the last episode. But again, the dosing here, we're talking about 20,000 IU per day, not per week, per day. And the rats here are even smaller. They're only 50 gram rats. So when we look at the human equivalent dose here, just of the one that he's quoting, of the aspect that he's quoting, and they actually did different doses in the study that we'll talk about, but just that one, that's a human equivalent dose of nearly 20,000. It's about 19,460 micrograms per kilogram. For an average weight 70 kilogram human, that's 1,364,500 micrograms, or the equivalent of 454 ounces of beef liver. In this case, that would be 28.4 pounds of beef liver per day. That is the dose that's used in this study.
It's really toxic, man. You should stay away from that vitamin A stuff.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, basically, this is just, it only goes downhill for the argument from here, because basically what we're just seeing is the doses get higher and higher and higher, and to points where it becomes unreasonable to induce toxicity for humans. Like it's physically impossible, I would say, to eat that much liver on a regular basis. So you would have to go out of your way to replicate this level of toxicity in a human by taking extremely concentrated, isolated forms of retinol or retinol palmitate or something like this. And it's just, yeah. So if anything, this is a safety study. This is how much vitamin A you can get away with in a particular period of time in 10 days, which again would be the equivalent of, what was it? It was 2 weeks was about a year for humans. So for 6 months to create the toxicity in humans. And it's like, nobody is doing this. This is not what people are shooting for. Nobody is saying this is a good idea. There's like, we're not having some vitamin A czar come on TV and say, yeah, everybody needs to have 28 pounds of beef liver a day, and that's the solution to all of our problems. Now, I'm like partially strawmanning Grant's argument here to exemplify like how extreme the situation is, but it's like, don't create like to start to try to determine that there's toxicity for this thing at normal doses that people are having on a regular basis. You cannot use these studies as an example. And then to even highlight things like for the previous one, oh, it's just one drop of this oil, this super concentrated oil for a really small weight animal for a time frame that's on the equivalency of months to years in humans. It's like, no, this is like a huge difference. It's like, oh, it's only in 10 days. It's like, okay, 6 months equivalency almost, or maybe a little bit more for humans.
10 months.
10 months at a ridiculous dosage. So this is not support for this argument. And the sad thing is these are the major pieces of information that he uses in his book to support the argument. The rest of the claims, as we talked about in the previous video, are largely unsupported by research. It's more just his personal hypothesis, which is fine, but then just categorize the book as fiction. Don't make it a nonfiction research study and don't support and without really supporting your information. And then when you do support your information, you say, "Oh, look how toxic it is." And then when we adjust the dose to what humans would have, it's highly improbable, borderline impossible that somebody is dosing at this level without trying to cause a problem for themselves.
Right. Well, and here's the kicker when it comes to the study. So he is citing a study titled Concerning the Toxicity of Vitamin A. And the quote that he uses is that in the introduction of that study where they're discussing a different study. So they're discussing this other study where they used 20,000 IU of vitamin A per day and they caused vitamin A toxicity in 10 days. He's stating it as if like that is what this study is supporting, but the study is actually refuting that study. So what they're going through in this other study titled Concerning the Toxicity of Vitamin A is saying that this other study, which was done by Palazzo and Rodriguez, they're basically trying to replicate those findings and confirm that in 10 days you can actually cause vitamin A toxicity with 20,000 IU per day. And what they find is that they use way higher doses, which we'll get to in a second, and what they find is not that. So they're actually refuting that dose is toxic and that you need a far higher dose, at least if you're doing it in that short of a period in time.
Yeah. I mean, again, like it's just going to ante up from here that the dosages get higher and higher and higher on a consistent basis. And it's like, yeah, we see toxicity at these doses, but I think the takeaway for people listening is like, you would really have to try to get to this level, and you wouldn't be able to do it with most food sources unless you're really drinking halibut liver oil or something like this on a regular basis. And even then, you would probably run into problems from other components in there, not necessarily even the vitamin A first, right? So this is the big thing is like when we're going through the vitamin A arguments, right? When clients are asking, or when people are reaching out and saying, just read the book. And then you read the book and this is what's cited and this is what's shown. It's like, this is a non-argument for the perspective that there's this conspiracy to create toxicity through vitamin A, and most people's problems are from vitamin A toxicity, and it happens at really low dosages. It's like, it doesn't happen at low dosages. And then you can indeed get a deficiency, which we talked about in the previous video. And it's unlikely that most people's problems that they're dealing with are specifically from vitamin A toxicity, even though it is possible for somebody to indeed become vitamin A toxic. It's just the dosages required are quite high.
Right. So yeah, let's go ahead and go through this study where they are looking at what dosages are actually legitimate for causing vitamin A toxicity. And this is the one titled Concerning the Toxicity of Vitamin A. Again, they are refuting that earlier study by Palazzo and Rodriguez showing that 20,000 IU per day for 10 days is enough to cause toxicity. Mike, do you want to go ahead and start us off here?
Sure. So basically, they replicated the study. They used a variety of different dosages. So, and the rats, it's important to note their weight because we're going to change it into dosage per kilogram. So the rats were 50 grams, and then the dosages they gave them were 25,000 IU, 50,000 IU, and then 100,000 IU. Now, when we convert this to an average weight human, 70 kilo human, 150 pounds, what we see is at the 25,000 IU per 50 gram rat, what we find that eventually adjusts to for a human is about 35.5 pounds of beef liver per day. Then when we look at a 50,000 IU per 50 gram rat, what we see for a human, that's the equivalent of about 71 pounds of beef liver per day. And then when we look at 100,000 IU per 50 gram rat, that's the equivalent for a human of about 142 pounds of beef liver per day. So the dosages required here to actually cause toxicity for these animals, and again, these researchers are trying to corroborate the previous study at the 20,000 IU per day, which was already the equivalent of 38 pounds or 28 pounds of beef liver for a human per day, is insane. Like, we're between 35 pounds to 142 pounds of beef liver per day for humans. So it's just, I think that's like a mic drop, right? It's who's eating this much beef liver? Not even Liver King is eating this much beef liver on a regular
You can't even
basis.
eat that many calories in a day, right? No one's eating the equivalent of 35
Or that
pounds
much
of beef liver in
protein,
calories.
or that much B
Right.
vitamins, or that much phosphorus. Like, there's multiple components in these dosages that would kill you besides the vitamin A, before the vitamin A, in terms of beef liver equivalent. So again, you would have to try with some type of pharmaceutical or supplemental vitamin A in a very concentrated form at high dosages for much longer time frames than are given for these rats to replicate these results. So this is not an example of how toxic vitamin A is. This is more of an example of there is a high threshold before toxicity sets in for humans.
In other words, how safe it is.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
And let's see what they find, because, you know, you would think, all right, at a dose of 140 pounds of beef liver per day, these rats would definitely be getting vitamin A toxicity in 10 days. They would have to be dead, right? That would have to be the assumption if, you know, such a small amount is toxic. Can you imagine having this much? Well, when we look at the results, that's not what happened. So in this first table here, this is series 2, they're identifying some of the effects at these different doses. And what they basically found was that in group 1, the 25,000 IU per day, they were totally normal in terms of their weight, and there was no identified issues. In group 2, this is the 50,000 IU per day, there was fractures in 2 of the rats. All of them lived to 100 days. So even though they were having the equivalent of 71 pounds of beef liver per day, they were totally fine for 100 days, which, keep in mind, multiply that by 30 to get the equivalent in humans. So we're talking about 3,000 days, which is about 8 years. And then in the third group, which is the 100,000 IU per day, or the equivalent of 142 pounds of beef liver, 2 of those rats, 2 out of the, looks like 8, lived, and 6 had fractures and presumably died earlier. So that's our first result. And then in the second result, they looked at other rats. They set up the study slightly differently, but we're using similar doses, again, looking at 50,000 IU per day and 100,000 IU per day, looking at the amounts in the liver as well. And again, same thing. For that 50,000 IU per day group, this is over 70 pounds of beef liver equivalent. All of the rats lived 100 days, and they were remarkably normal. And in the 100,000 IU per day group, 3 of the rats lived to 100 days, and 2 had fractures. Here we're looking at, it looks like 8 rats again. And I forgot to mention series 1, where again, the 100,000 IU group showed significant vitamin A toxicity effects. None of the rats lived 100 days, and they had fractures and hemorrhages. In the 50,000 IU group, 1 of the 4 rats died in 40 days. The rest lived all of the 100 days, and they all had fractures, so showing moderate signs of vitamin A toxicity. And then there wasn't any apparent evidence of toxicity in the 25,000 IU group, except for some decreases in weight. Now, it's also worth mentioning, as you can see, they allude to this in the footnote here, that in the study, they evaluated the potency of the retinol and the oil they were using, and they estimated the biological activity to be about 1/3 less than the measured amount of retinol. But either way, we're still talking about absolutely massive doses of retinol in all of the groups that were being studied. So contrary to this idea that, you know, massive amounts of vitamin A are going to cause toxicity in a short period of time, this is a pretty good study in support of the safety of vitamin A. And they have a couple of quotes along those lines, and they state, "The term toxicity means poisonous. Many food materials such as sodium chloride or iodine can become deleterious in large quantities, but they are not called poisons. Neither should fish oils be called poisons because they are injurious when fed in enormous quantities. But some term is necessary to refer to this deleterious action in these experiments, and we have used toxicity with the understanding that in the usual doses, the various ingredients of such oils may be necessary in the diet. We may conclude from this experiment, which was repeated with the same result, that if vitamin A is toxic, it must be given in higher dosage than 100,000 IU daily to 50 gram rats, and that at least the greater part of the toxicity of the various fish liver oils must be due to some other factor than vitamin A. And that last part is a reference to those other studies basically saying there's no way that even 20,000 IU per day for 10 days could have caused those effects. Again, we are not saying these are ideal doses of vitamin A. Nobody is talking about, no one is suggesting consuming these amounts of beef liver or retinol equivalents in any other foods. Yeah, but this is showing that you need massive, massive quantities to cause outright toxicity and death. And it's a far cry from what Grant's suggesting here.
Yeah, I think that's the important point here is I want to make it clear, we are not making the case that people should be taking massively high doses of vitamin A. All we are saying is that the dosages that were required to cause the toxicity that Grant is implying are ridiculously high in humans. That's the important context. It's the frame to come out with this. It's not saying it can't be toxic. It's also saying when we're saying you can have a deficiency. So where is optimal for your particular circumstance? So we will talk about other specific contexts down the line in future video. But I think this is what we're trying to get at here is look, the toxicity studies that Grant is citing himself are ridiculously high in their dosages when you start looking at it in humans, and also the time frames are much longer when you start looking at equivalencies for lifespan.
Yeah, all really solid points there. And so moving on to the next one, this is a study that Grant referenced in an episode of the Rejuvenate podcast with Elwyn Robinson. And Elwyn was asking him, So Owen was asking him, he was saying there are a large amount of studies that back up that vitamin A excess is extremely dangerous, and was asking Grant to share some of those studies. And Grant shared this study titled Hypervitaminosis A in the Young Pig. Mike, go ahead and start us off there.
Yeah, so in the podcast is interesting because Grant was talking about how terrible the effects of vitamin A were in these animals at really high dosages, or at the dosages in the study. And basically what they did is they took young pigs on an average weight of about 8 kilograms, and they had them consume diets that contain 0, 1, 100, 11,000, 110,000, or 1,100,000 units of vitamin A per kilogram of diet. And then for all of the feed, or on average for all of the feed consumption per pig, until you get to the 1,100,000 IU of vitamin A per kilogram of diet, most of the animals ate about a kilogram of food per day. So they were getting about the dosages that we saw, 100, 11,000, or 110,000 IUs per day. But when they got to the 1,100,000 IUs per day, possibly because the dose was so high for vitamin A, it actually led to them eating a little bit less. So they ate roughly half a kilogram per day of food at the 1,100,000 IU per kilogram of food per day dose. Now, what this winds up looking at, and we're going to take the two top dosages, the 110,000 and the 1,100,000, because the other dosages are not really that high. And basically what we're looking at for human, if we convert the 110,000 IU per kilogram of diet per day for human, that is the equivalent of about 78 ounces of beef liver per day, which is about 4.85 pounds of beef liver per day at the 110,000 dose. Now, when we get to the 1,100,000 dose, they didn't get that full dose per day because, again, they only ate about half a kilo, so they got half of that dose. And basically what that would be the equivalent of about 335 ounces of beef liver per day, or 21 pounds. And the interesting thing is the only group of pigs in this study that developed significant or serious symptoms of vitamin A toxicity was the 1,100,000 IU per kilogram of diet per day dose, and the 110,000 IU per kilogram per day diet dose didn't really have any significant obvious symptoms and were generally healthy. So, or at least symptoms that would indicate toxicity. So this is even further evidence of the degree of safety that you have with vitamin A at high doses. Again, that humans wouldn't really be consuming. No one would really be consuming almost 5 pounds of beef liver per day or the equivalent of vitamin A in that intake, let alone 21 pounds. And even with that, the pigs were relatively free of obvious symptoms for the duration of the study at the equivalency of 5 pounds of beef liver per day dose of vitamin A. So again, more evidence cited by Grant himself that is showing the relative safety of vitamin A, not necessarily the toxicity.
Right. And it's shared as though, look at how bad vitamin A is. Look at what it did to these pigs. They were, dealing with all these really awful symptoms. They died in a few weeks. This is so terrible. And it's irresponsible to make it sound as though that has anything to do with vitamin A that is consumed in a normal amount in a normal human. I mean, it's just, yes, toxic doses, massive doses of pretty much any nutrient, like they talked about in the last study. You do the same thing with iodine or sodium. You're going to cause issues at way lower doses relative to what is typically eaten. So it's really awful. And so they kind of state the results at the end of the study with a quote saying, toxicity appeared after 14 days when 3 pigs fed the diet containing 1,100,000 IU of added vitamin A per kilogram died. No visible external manifestations of vitamin A toxicity were evident before death. Post-mortem examination revealed massive internal hemorrhages. After 21 days, all remaining pigs on this diet, but none on the other diets, exhibited symptoms of hypervitaminosis A, similar to those previously described for other species. And there's a citation there. So again, no other symptoms or signs of excess vitamin A in those other groups, including the one that was consuming nearly 5 pounds of beef liver per day. So yeah, I mean, what more is there to say?
Yeah, it's another mic drop. It's like you're looking at it and you're saying, okay, there actually is deficiency, which we've proved with other studies. And it's like the threshold for toxicity is pretty high. So it's like the entire argument, this entire low vitamin A component is just completely falling flat. Like there's not really strong evidence cited by the originator of this stuff to validate his points. And that's the problem is like, and the frustrating thing about it is that there's this perspective that, well, we know that there is vitamin A toxicity and then even in videos that I made about it on my own YouTube channel is like, I'm open to the idea that the threshold for toxicity is lower than is stated by, the current guidelines. But then when you look at these studies, it's like, well, that just went out the window. That being open to that idea just completely went out the window when you start really digging in the research in depth. And without even having to dig in the other research, just looking at the studies that Grant cited here to support his point, it's like you don't even have to look at some of the other research. We did it anyway, just because out of curiosity, like I genuinely wanted to know once I started looking more than I did. Wanted to know more than I did, but when I looked at these studies, it was like, wow, this is what all this is about. This is what the fanfare is about with this stuff. It's like, this is not well supported. And these studies are actually proving the opposite of his point. It's like, I don't even have to go outside of the studies that he used to counter the arguments, the 2 major arguments that are the foundational components. So it's like everything else inside the low vitamin A sphere is built upon this perspective, and the perspective doesn't even have foundational supports. So it's like it's just a mic drop for these perspectives overall for the vitamin A toxicity piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is again using the studies chosen by Grant that he's choosing to cite. So let's take a look at a different study. This is another one showing very large amounts of vitamin A being required in order to cause toxicity. And they also look at the retinol content in the liver and the concentration. And so this is that one that will compare with the original, that first study that Grant cited about the halibut liver oil, and will give us some clear evidence that, I mean, obviously based on these other studies, that study is off. Certain things about it are not accurately reported, but most likely in the dose. And we see that here when we compare the effect, the retinol concentrations in the liver. So The study is titled Metabolism of Retinol Binding Protein and Vitamin A During Hypervitaminosis A in the Rat. And they did 2 different studies here. So in the first one, the rats were given a vitamin A deficient diet to start that was then supplemented with 1.2 micrograms of retinol per day just to make sure they weren't actually deficient. But again, talking about the variation between diets and going back to the original deficiency studies, looking at lard versus butter, they take all those possible variables out here. All of them are on the same diet with just different amounts of added vitamin A. The baseline diet is vitamin A deficient, and they add a little bit of vitamin A to prevent deficiency. And then once they reached a weight of 110 grams, they were split into 3 groups. So there was 3 groups, and they were each given different amounts of vitamin A per day in the form of retinol acetate, and they give the doses in milligrams per day because this is a lot of micrograms. So the control diet gets 0.14 milligrams per day. That's 140 micrograms per day in per weight, or by weight, which of course they're 110 gram rats, as we mentioned. And so the human equivalent dose for this control group ends up being 6,300 micrograms of retinol per day, or 2 ounces of beef liver per day. So the control group here, the one that they're comparing vitamin A excess with, is getting a large amount of vitamin A. They're getting the equivalent of 2 ounces of beef liver. In the next 2 groups, the second one is given 7.3 milligrams a day, so 7,300 micrograms per day of retinol. The human equivalent dose here is 10,800 micrograms per kilogram, or 750,000 micrograms for an average weight human, getting us to 251 ounces of beef liver per day. That's our first group, or our second group. And then the third group here is for 25 days, they're given 1,800 micrograms of retinol per day. And then after that point, they're given 41,000 micrograms of retinol per day. So they're given a kind of moderately high dose for a bit, and then a very, very high dose. And again, remember, 25 days, we're not talking 25 days for a human, this is 25 days for a rat. So this is, you're multiplying that by 30. We're talking over 2 years human equivalents here, just on each of these doses. And so when you look at the 1,800 micrograms per day, this is the equivalent of 27 ounces of beef liver per day when you do the human equivalents. And then for the 41,000 micrograms per day, or 41 milligrams per day, this is the equivalent of 620 ounces of beef liver. So the highest dose here that they're using is 620 ounces, the equivalent of 620 ounces of beef liver per day, or nearly 39 pounds of beef liver. And then after day 50, the high vitamin A groups stopped receiving vitamin A so that they were allowed to recover from the vitamin A toxicity. So we will look at how long that takes and how well they recover when given these insane amounts of vitamin A, of retinol. And then again, before we go into the results, I just want to touch on, so they did a second experiment as well within the study where the rats were given the same vitamin A deficient diet with the 140 micrograms of retinol per day. Once they reached a weight of 300 grams, they were then split into 2 groups. One continued on as the control, getting the 0.14 milligrams per day. And then the other group was given 34,000 micrograms per day of retinol. And this is the equivalent, based on their weight being higher at 300 grams, this is the equivalent of 429 ounces per day, or nearly 27 pounds of beef liver, again, when you do the human equivalents. So just as the setup here, talking about very, very large doses, and we can see how much it took to cause hypervitaminosis A, how much it took to cause vitamin A toxicity, and also how quickly they recovered and what all the symptoms were. So looking at the results here, and we can take a look at this figure which depicts it. So in the control group, of course, they grew fine. And then in group 2, there was a slightly lower growth rate. It wasn't statistically significant, but a slightly slower growth rate, although they appeared totally healthy. Remember, this is the group that was getting the equivalent of 251 ounces of beef liver per day. Appeared healthy, slightly slower growth rate. Group 3 showed that their growth rate stopped starting at day 25 when they went on to the massive quantity, the 41,000 micrograms per day, or the equivalent of 620 ounces or 39 pounds of beef liver with the human equivalent dose. So they were on that amount, and at that point they stopped growing, and they did experience signs of hypervitaminosis A at that point. They had reduced food intake, depressed growth, alopecia, thickening of the skin, occasional bleeding from the nose, weakness or partial paralysis of their legs. They were also aggressive. So they had full-on vitamin A toxicity symptoms during that 25-day period where they were eating the equivalent amount of retinol as 39 pounds of beef liver per day for an average weight human. So massive amounts. However, They didn't die. They were fine. And again, this was for 25 days, which is the equivalent of 2 years in human time. And then after, they stopped supplementing them with that amount of vitamin A, and they recovered and grew totally fine. There was basically no issues other than fatty liver, which was still seen in groups 2 and 3 that were given these massive quantities, but they were basically able to live relatively normally. And they state this in a quote. They say, varying degrees of vitamin A toxicity were observed. The rats fed a moderately excessive dose of vitamin A of 7.3 milligrams per day, grew somewhat less well than did the control rats, but appeared clinically healthy. Large excesses of vitamin A, either 41 or 34 milligrams per day, however, produced severe manifestations of vitamin A toxicity and cessation of growth. Again, it's worth noting that these are not only massive quantities for extended periods of time that cause vitamin A toxicity, but the recovery was pretty immediate when they stopped the supplementation, which is so different from the narrative that's being told in this circle, in this sphere. And then the last thing that's worth mentioning here that we alluded to prior was looking at the concentrations in the liver. So again, we're talking about extremely high doses here of retinol. And when they look at the amount of increase in the liver compared to the controls, there was basically 21 times as much retinol in the liver compared to the control group. In that earlier study we were talking about with the halibut liver oil, and they were supposedly only doing 1 drop a day of the 40,000 IU per gram.
1 drop per week.
Halibut oil. 1 drop per week. Thank you. In that study, the rats had 55 times as much retinol in their livers as the control group. So something is obviously not adding up here when they were given supposedly a fraction of the dose, and yet they had way more retinol in their livers when compared to what was looked at in this study.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway from this, there's 2 for me. One, we have a study with really high dosages where we see only a 21 times concentration of retinol in the liver compared to a control, which gives us some information to be able to put in context the 50 times concentration of retinol or the 55 times concentration of retinol in the controls in the halibut liver oil study that Grant's like, oh, look, they just took 1 drop of oil per week and in the X number of weeks they got sick. It's like the dose is probably excessively high. And we could make the argument again that it's possibly 40,000 IU per week for low weight rats, which for human equivalent doses is quite high and are possibly even higher than what we are anticipating. And then the second piece here is that you have rats on dosages equivalent to, almost 40 pounds of beef liver per day in vitamin A intake. And yeah, it really messed them up. It definitively messed them up. However, once they stop taking those dosages, they're able to recover. They're able to start to recover from those toxicity effects. And there are human case studies inside PubMed where you see people take really high dosages of vitamin A and they do recover. Does it beat up on the liver? Yes, it does, because the liver is the main storage site of retinol, and you have certain types of cells, the stellate cells, that are going to store this vitamin A. And as you get really high dosages, you start to go over capacity, you can start to cause problems. But the people do recover. People are able to recover from the toxicity. The liver takes a little bit more time because it takes time to deplete the storage. But again, these are on extremely high dosages. And so I think that it's helpful to see, like, look, there is recovery potential here. It's not just this toxin that's just decimating these animals. And I don't want to open the full can of worms here, but the thing that we're seeing is, like, I'm waiting to see all these autoimmune diseases in these rats. I'm just going to drop that here in these toxicity studies because we're not seeing autoimmune diseases per se in these animals, which was one of Grant's arguments. We're just seeing the vitamin A toxicity stuff that they then recover from, even though they still have high stores of it. And once they stop taking those very high dosages. So I think that's also important to point out. And we're not really going to get into the autoimmune piece, purely because there was no research cited to back that perspective up. There was just some interesting drawings in Grant's theory there. But we're not really seeing those symptoms play out in the human toxicity studies, the case studies, or in these animals, these rat toxicity studies for vitamin A. Well, we are seeing vitamin A toxicity symptoms.
Yeah. And not only was there no cited research for the autoimmune claims being made, but there wasn't even a cohesive argument being made for it anyway. There was really nothing to even try to, like, we were happy to try to look into it and then consider refuting it if there was anything to even look into in the first place, and there just wasn't. So anyway, when it comes to the vitamin A toxicity, the hypervitaminosis A, I think we can wrap that piece up here, where very obviously the doses needed are absolutely
insane.
Staggering. Yeah, insane. And this doesn't mean that somebody can't have vitamin A toxicity, but the amounts that we would need to be talking about are pretty hard to get. It's not going to happen probably by accident unless you have some major other metabolic issues going on, which again, we'll talk about in the future. But I think there's not much else to say on that regard. And we can move on and talk about the next piece that Grant discusses, which is basically the toxicity or potential toxicity of retinoic acid and his claims there. So let's dig into that. All right, so we're going to dig into some of the primary arguments made by Grant in regard to retinoic acid being toxic. And so this will be from the subheading in his book, which is titled Retinoic Acid as an Acne Drug, the Toxicity Stress Test. And so what he basically does here is he talks about Accutane, which is a form of retinoic acid called 13-cis-retinoic acid. And he's suggesting that it's toxic, and because it's toxic, the assumption is that retinoic acid is therefore toxic as a whole. And this is really the primary argument he makes for the toxicity of retinoic acid. And it's all centered around Accutane and the effects of it, which, as we'll get at, are not particularly relevant to the question of whether retinoic acid is toxic for a number of reasons. For one, it has very little to do with any amount of first off, it is just a single metabolite or a single form of retinoic acid called 13-cis-retinoic acid. There are several others, and providing this one form of retinoic acid in extremely high doses is something that you can only recreate by taking massive amounts of this drug. It basically has nothing to do with anything that would happen from normal physiological effects of consuming retinol or beta carotene or any other carotenoids you're going to have in your food. You're to say that this is equivalent to any effects of that is just it just is not, let's just say, not accurate. It just is totally irrelevant. That being said, we're going to evaluate some of the claims he makes even about the toxicity of Accutane, and then talk through some of the details in terms of Accutane as a chemotherapeutic agent as well, used as chemotherapy. We'll be talking about that and some other aspects as far as retinoic acid goes. So as a starting place, as a suggestion from that subheading, he's basically saying that considering that retinoic acid is used as an acne drug and has certain toxicity, that is a suggestion that retinoic acid itself is toxic. First thing to note here is that Accutane, which is the acne drug he's referring to, is 13-cis-retinoic acid, which does not have the same physiological effects as other forms of retinoic acid, like 9-cis-retinoic acid or all-trans retinoic acid. These are shown to have different physiological effects. So to say that because there are certain potential harms from 13-cis-retinoic acid does not mean that all forms of retinoic acid have those same effects. And that's one important thing to consider. But the next thing to consider is his evaluation of Accutane being toxic. And so he has a quote stating, or he says, "Just how toxic is Accutane? Well, over the full course of treatment for young adults, the total amount of the drug taken is about 5 or 6 grams. If that amount were taken in one shot, it could easily be a lethal dose." So a couple of points here. We'll talk about the kind of cumulative dosing for someone, and it could end up being in that 5 to 6 gram range over, when it's taken over typically 16 to 20 weeks. So typically the drug is taken over 4 to 5 months, at which point you would you would have taken in a cumulative amount of 5 to 6 grams of the 13-cis-retinoic acid. And that the fact that, let's say, so for one, there's no evidence cited for the fact that could be lethal. I mean, you could say anything could be lethal and you can get away with it because you're saying could and you're not actually saying anything. But if you actually look at the doses that are suggested for lethality in a single dose, If you look at the LD50 for a rat, it's over 4,000 milligrams per kilogram of Accutane. And if you convert that to a human equivalent dose for an average weight human, that's the equivalent of 45 grams of Accutane. So not 5 or 6 grams, but 45 grams being required as the LD50. I haven't seen any suggestion of any other amount being toxic, but that's the amount that would supposedly kill 50% at least of rats when given in a single dose. So for one, that's many times higher, about 9 times higher, or 8-ish, depending on 5 or 6 grams. Quite a bit higher than the dosing he's talking about. But also, there are very few drugs, vitamins, minerals, substances where you could take the amount that you would be given not only over 4 to 5 months, the amount that you would take in over 4 to 5 months, but in this case, if we're talking 45 grams, multiply that by, again, 8 or 9 times. If you can take a substance that much, or you need to take that amount of a substance for it to kill you, that's actually a really good support for how safe it is. You can't, like, if you look at any vitamin or mineral for the most part, or we talked about this earlier with water, with sodium, with iron. I mean, you could talk about with so many different things, selenium, certain B vitamins. If you were to take the amount that you would be, I mean, and this is in a way higher dose than you would ever eat, right? We're talking about massive doses given in a drug. But if you were to take the total amount that you were going to have over 20 weeks and take it at once, there's a lot of situations where that could be toxic. That does not mean that the substance itself is a poison or is a toxic. Is toxic. It's terrible support for that concept. And so I'll kind of leave it there unless you go ahead, Mike. But that's just a starting place here.
I think the overarching perspective that's really important for me when I think about this is that Grant is trying to use Accutane as an example of vitamin A or retinoic acid's toxicity. And then so first of all, like what you already pointed out, Jay, is that Accutane and retinoic acid, like these different structures, changes the effects of these compounds. And so to just try to conflate the things together to make your argument doesn't make any sense from the get-go. You have to look at what the specific effects are of each different compound. Because as we already see, like retinol esters versus retinol versus retinoic acid versus different derivatives from there with different modifications to the structures changes the effects massively. And we see this with many different areas. We see this with many different substances. For example, just to put this in perspective for people, if you have regular bioidentical progesterone, its structure may be semi-similar to some of the synthetic progestins, but then what happens is when you start adding and modifying the structure, you get different effects. And when you look at the research, what you see is bioidentical progesterone is at best neutral, if not possibly beneficial and protective or associated with a protective benefit against breast cancer and things like this. Whereas when you look at the synthetic progestins, it's like, oh, look, we have some toxicity here and there's an increased risk of breast cancer with their usage. So to just say like, oh, this is like progesterone and it's bad, so then progesterone is bad, that's not argumentation. That's just logical fallacy at its best. And so I don't think that, like with Grant's perspective here, like he's doing this same thing. And if this is from like a logical perspective, this is not a logical argument. This is just him basically conflating a bunch of things together, and then it gets even worse because then you start to say, oh, like, look, Accutane is toxic at this specific dosage. And it's like, he's not even correct there. He's not even right. You look at the LD50 for rats, as you mentioned, Jay, greater than 4,000 milligrams per kilogram. And then you convert that to human dose. What's it, like 600 something milligrams per kilogram for a human, which gives you this 45 gram target. And Grant is saying, oh, look, 5 grams in one sitting could be lethal. It's like, well, actually we're seeing 45 grams. And then even beyond that, it's like the dosing for humans is not to take 5 grams in one sitting. There's not a single person saying dose 5 grams of Accutane in one sitting. They're saying, look, you have this schedule, 0.5 to 1 milligram per kilogram over a period of 16 to 20 weeks. And then it's like, let's take this total amount of the 16 to 20 weeks and give it to somebody in one period of time and say, look, it killed them. It's like, I could do that for any single substance. I can do that for almost every substance that somebody's eating right now. I can look at whatever, it's like as an example, and you have this set out in the argumentation here, Jay, is let's take water. Take all the water that you're going to have over the next 16 to 20 weeks and take it in one sitting and see if you live. It's like, that's not
just a few days.
Yeah, that's not even an argument. for why this is toxic. If anything, what you're seeing here is you could take, based on this dosing schedule, you could take the full 16 to 20 week course of Accutane in one sitting and still not approach the LD50, which is the lethal dose for 50% of people at that dosage. And so it's like, this is, again, it's the same thing with his toxicity arguments. And it's the same thing with his deficiency arguments. He's actually supporting the opposite point with what he's saying, and with the points that he's making. He doesn't even realize it. And again, you and I, neither of us are saying like, yeah, let's take a bunch of Accutane. Both of us agree it's not problem. It's like a pretty problematic substance to use, and there's reasons why you wouldn't want to use it. And even, and this is the whole thing, is like poisoning for profits, the manufacturers and the doctors and prescribers are saying how toxic it is by saying like, look, you have to sign up to this database that says that you have to be on birth control and you cannot get pregnant while you take Accutane because of these problems. And they list out all the side effects of the drug. So it's like they're telling you the risk beforehand, and then you're making the decision around, do I take this drug or not? And it's like, if you look at the actual risk, like, yeah, probably not a good idea. There's problems with it, but we're also seeing like, here's this really toxic drug, and you could take really high dosages of it, and it's not giving you the toxicity that Grant is saying. And then I'll leave this here so you can get into the next point, Jay, but it's like, would we ever see these levels under normal circumstances? Like, that's the next question. Is it just when you take Accutane, or like, will you get this under normal circumstances? Because, you know, the toxicity is cumulative, right?
Right. And the point you're getting at too is, does this have anything to do with the amount of retinoic acid you're ever going to be producing from retinol that you're consuming? Or even if you were to consume retinoic acid in foods in the tiny amounts that it exists, does that have anything to do with toxicity of Accutane? And the short answer is no. So when considering the dosing for acne, and then looking at the levels in the blood of 13-cis retinoic acid and all trans retinoic acid, what you see is that the levels reach basically massive amounts relative to what's ever normally seen in normal physiological states. So with Accutane, levels of 13-cis retinoic acid in the blood are seen between 1,000 and 5,000 nanomoles per liter. Typical levels are 1 to 5 nanomoles per liter. So we're talking about 1,000 times the normal amount in your blood. Again, there are very, very few things that you could add. Like, you could multiply by 1,000. You could take 1,000 times that amount that's normally in your blood, put it in your blood, and you could even be alive. Most things that are in your blood, you cannot add 1,000-fold of them and put them in your blood and be okay. So this is actually, again, not saying that Accutane is a good idea or that it's a healthy thing, but this is actually support for how safe it is relative to things that are actually toxic or poisonous, or even things that are totally benign. The point being, this alone is not at all good evidence for the toxicity of something. And when you look at all trans retinoic acid, which things like 13-cis retinoic acid get converted into, with the use of Accutane, you typically see levels of 50 to 100 nanomoles per liter. And in a normal state, you're seeing levels of 1 to 10 nanomoles per liter. So at least, on the low end, we're seeing 10 times the normal physiological levels, and on the high end, as much as 100 times. So this is very, very far from anything that's ever happening physiologically. Which brings us to the next point. Again, talking about dosing, talking about levels in the blood. Grant, and he's said this in interviews, he says it in lots of different places. He talks about how, quote, retinoic acid is a chemotherapy drug. That's the general line. And he has a subheading titled Accutane as a chemotherapy drug, the extreme toxicity stress test. And he states, the use of retinoic acid as an acne treatment originated from the use of it in chemotherapy. This is not just approximately the same drug. No, it is exactly the same drug, the same molecule, the same isomer of it, and even the same product named version of it, Accutane. So if the use of Accutane as an acne treatment is the medium stress test of retinoic acid toxicity on the human body, then being given the Accutane treatment in cancer cases is the extreme stress test. So again, the idea that looking at Accutane has anything to do with retinoic acid's toxicity in the human body is absurd. At least it's only relevant in so much as someone is using one of these drugs. It is completely irrelevant when it comes to somebody who is not using these drugs and is consuming even massive amounts of vitamin A. You're never going to see these sorts of levels. And that is even more so the case when it comes to the use of it as a chemotherapeutic agent. So yes, the same 13-cis retinoic acid is used as a chemotherapeutic agent, and it's used in extremely high doses. And these doses, typically they're around 5 milligrams per kilogram per day. So again, massive doses. And this leads to concentrations, again, of 13-cis retinoic acid that are over 1,000 times normal levels. Again, this is, if anything, support for its safety. The fact that you can get that, whether it's from Accutane for acne or Accutane for chemotherapy, and not drop dead immediately is, if anything, support for the general safety of this compound. Again, not saying that this is a good idea, but just support for the fact that it is not particularly toxic or poisonous. And again, totally irrelevant to anything other than the situation where you are consuming massive doses of this medication.
Yeah. And I think it's not particularly relevant to the idea that this is toxic in the normal amounts that you generally consume. So it's like if you were to take the drug in high dosages for cancer, you will likely get a bunch of side effects, which you could argue are toxicity. But to talk about it, and because the reason we're talking about it this way is because Grant positions this in terms of the lethal dose, like how much would be lethal. And it's like, we're not seeing lethal doses at these really high levels that are thousands of times higher than what you would typically see with normal consumption patterns. And so it's like this, again, like I think Grant needs to really understand the specific context of what dosing is. So like trying to figure out like what does 1 glass of water do to you versus 1,000 glasses of water? Like really trying to delineate like, well, is water toxic because at 1,000 glasses it causes problems? Is water toxic because at 500 glasses it causes problems? It's like, is that really going to be the barometer for which you engage with things in terms of defining them as toxic? And if that is the case, like it's basically a non-argument forever, because there's not really going to be any substance that you'd be like, oh yeah, at these extremely high dosages and 1,000 times what you would normally see, this thing is toxic, so therefore it must be toxic. And then to like, I don't know if this is just like not understanding the level of argumentation or if this is like done on purpose, but it's like it's a very salesy tactic to be like, oh look, Accutane's a chemotherapy drug, so therefore it must be toxic, and like kind of like conflate it in those types of things. It's like you can have a drug, like you can have an antibiotic or a substance that helps you overcome infection that isn't necessarily toxic to your system. Maybe it's helping you overcome infection by improving your own immune function. And so it's like the mechanism also becomes important to just say, oh, anything that's in this chemotherapy class of drugs or this like it's determined as something that's helpful for cancer or it can treat cancer in any type of way is automatically toxic. Is like, that is also not a logical argument. And that's like a bit of a conflation. Is like, how exactly is this thing working? Is it working by reintroducing differentiation of a cell from an undifferentiated growth-dominated state towards a cell that's moving to a differentiation state where it's in coherence with the organism, and it's doing that without creating toxicity? It's like, sure, you could classify that as a chemotherapeutic agent, but it doesn't necessarily automatically mean it's toxic. And so his arguments are imprecise, they're not logical, and there's tons of conflation going on. And so it's like, and then there's also not even sources for some of the stuff that he's saying. It's not like he's sourcing the toxicity doses in the LD50s. Like, we are pulling this out from the research by ourselves to be like, okay, is he right? Is he like clear on this? Is this correct? Is this the right value based on what the researchers are telling us? It's like, it's not even that. So it's like, where is this argument coming from? Is this individual coming from a perspective of, I think vitamin A is toxic, and therefore I'm going to try to create arguments to justify my perspective? Or is he going into the research and saying, hey, look at all these problems with vitamin A, and then like, I think maybe it's toxic? And I think it's actually the former position. He took a position and then is backwards rationalizing his whole perspective using non-logical arguments, and then adding spins to it, like, oh, look at this cod liver dose. If I take 1 drop, in 1 drop in this time frame, it's super toxic. Like, vitamin A just be really toxic. It's like, dude, what's the equivalency of a lifespan to a rat versus a human? And then how much is this dose on a per kilogram basis in a human equivalent dose? And it's like, and you start to look at it like, okay, so this is like what, like 30 pounds of liver a day equivalency for vitamin A? And it's the same thing here with retinoic acid and Accutane. It's like, there's this molecule that has retinoic acid in the name with some modifications to the structure, And if we give really high doses, it's toxic. See, retinoic acid is toxic. It's like, that's not how this works. It's like, what is the difference in how these molecules function? What is the dose where there is toxicity? What is the normal dose that we're having on a regular basis? And then let's determine, like, is it actually toxic? And basically what we've done here, and Jay, what you've laid out, is that there's not the toxicity at these normal dosages, and his arguments aren't even supporting that. They're supporting the opposite. It's like, look, you have quite a bit of room before you really run into significant problems. And yeah, like if you take this drug at high dosages for like really extreme context, you're definitely going to see some issues. But even then, it's not causing death, which is what Grant was initially implying.
Right. And as you were saying too, there's a lot of things that will cause death in much lower concentrations, much lower factors, right? If you take the amount of testosterone in your blood and multiply it by 1,000 times, if you take the amount of triglycerides or free fatty acids or glucose in your blood and multiply it by 1,000 times, or sodium, I mean, just pick something, multiply it by 1,000 times and see what happens. That doesn't mean any of those things are toxic. So anyway, there's one last argument that Grant makes that is worth touching on very briefly, because it's an argument that we see made in a lot of different contexts where someone basically looks at a pathway and they look at some part of that pathway or some end product and they say, this thing is bad, so don't take the precursor because it will automatically become that end product. And he does this with retinoic acid. Again, not that there's good support for the retinoic acid actually being toxic, but he then makes the argument that if you take any precursor, it will automatically become retinoic acid. And so he states, now there have been two very important points I wanted to make in this chapter. Firstly, that vitamin A will normally and naturally convert to retinoic acid. This is not a theory, and it is not speculation. It is completely proven in clinical research. Therefore, over time, we are all very slowly giving ourselves the retinoic acid treatment. For most adults, it is just going to ever so slowly, progressively get worse as we get older. So, first off, just red flags. When someone is saying that something is absolutely proven and they're really creating they're using this like intensely persuasive type of language, like this isn't a theory, it's not speculation, it's completely proven in the research, that should be a red flag just in general. That's normally a claim that's being made that is way stronger than any of the substance that is behind it. And that's definitely the case in this situation. So to assume that any vitamin A will automatically convert to retinoic acid is a complete fallacy. It is completely ignoring all of the things that regulate the conversion from retinol to retinoic acid, or if you want to look at the carotenoids and retinoic acid, there are multiple steps that have to be accomplished in order for that to be the case. And there's tons of different ways that those steps can be impeded, blocked, or that are generally just regulated. There's enzymatic regulation, there's factors like transport and availability of the different precursors, hormonal, factors here that will affect the regulation here. And people make this argument with other things as well. So people will say, there's this idea of the pregnenolone steal, where it's like if you consume or use pregnenolone, it will automatically increase cortisol, or it'll automatically increase estrogen, despite the fact that pregnenolone actually reduces the conversion of precursors to cortisol or to estrogen. Same thing can happen with lots of other hormones. The same arguments are made. People often don't, but could make the same claim about GABA. If you take GABA, it's automatically going to become glutamate, so don't take GABA. Or if you take glycine, it's automatically going to become oxalate, so don't take glycine. There's so many steps of regulation, so many metabolic factors, hormonal regulation, tons of things going on that need to be considered in this situation. And it's another argument that was made quite a bit with vitamin D, right? If you're taking vitamin D, it's automatically going to become the 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D. So that is a fallacy in and of itself. And one of the most important things, and a very simple one to recognize in this case, is that the production of retinoic acid is self-limiting. It actually has its own negative feedback where when you produce retinoic acid, it reduces its own production, basically so that when you have enough of the end product, it slows its own production. And this happens in tons of different pathways. This isn't unique to retinoic acid. It's a really, really common phenomenon. And so there's a very clear depiction of it here from a study titled Generation of Retinaldehyde for Retinoic Acid Biosynthesis. And they show it very clearly in this figure. the conversion from retinol to retinaldehyde and then to retinoic acid. And that retinoic acid has negative feedback on the conversion of retinol to retinaldehyde, which is done by different retinol dehydrogenases. So basically, as you have more retinoic acid, it reduces the conversion from retinol to retinaldehyde. And then it actually increases the conversion back from retinaldehyde to retinol by increasing these other enzymes, which are retinoid oxidoreductive complexes. And those convert retinaldehyde back to retinol. So again, just mentioning that very briefly, it's something that, again, Grant claims as if this doesn't exist. It's proven that any retinol you take all will automatically be converted to retinoic acid. And so it's easy to create the toxic amounts that you would get from insane doses in something like Accutane. Yet, even if you had massive doses of retinol, the production of retinoic acid is going to be self-limiting to a large extent because of negative feedback loops like this and tons of other regulation that goes on between these different steps that is just really completely ignored.
Yeah, I think it's it's interesting to just look at things in this extremely reductionistic pathway and say, look, it can convert down this direction, instead of understanding like the end products have feedbacks, the intermediaries have feedbacks, and then the individual component itself affects those feedback loops, and you have multiple converging factors on the entire system where basically like the contextual state of the organism is shifting how things are being metabolized. So like if you take pregnenolone into the system, the pregnenolone can help to lower stress directly, which can help to lower its conversion to cortisol. And then also if the state is really bad, maybe it will increase cortisol to some extent, but it's like, that's a big if, and you have to like consider multiple factors with that. And this goes to like what the big problem with all of this vitamin A stuff is, or even many of these like singular reductionistic pathways in terms of trying to understand health, or like these different fads, is this idea that like, oh, it's just about vitamin A. Vitamin A is just a toxin. It's everyone's problem. It's driving all of these issues. It's like, it is such a myopic perspective, especially when you start to consider all the other factors that are converging on health simultaneously. It's like, this couldn't be right. Just like as a heuristic model, as like a general way to filter things. If there's like, this is just the one thing and that's it, it's like, all right, that's probably, there's a probability that just this one thing is highly unlikely. It's most likely a combination of multiple factors. And sure, in some individuals, is vitamin A toxicity a problem? That's definitely a possibility. But it would be dependent upon their individual context. And then even with that said, like when you look with vitamin A toxicity, it's like, okay, they stop using vitamin A, and then there's multiple other components that can be converging. Maybe they've been chronic alcoholics. Maybe they have low protein intake. Maybe they're vitamin D and E and K deficient, so it's exacerbating their vitamin A deficiency. Maybe they have a problem going on in the liver, like hepatitis or fatty liver or something like this. So it's like, even with that model, there's multiple regulatory steps that have to be overcome, and there's multiple factors involved that can be problematic. So this myopic perspective is just, and like this idea that there's this pathway and things are just going to move in this linear pathway, I think is a lack of understanding fundamentally of how these things work. And I think thinking about things in that way exemplifies that the individual doesn't really understand how things work to some extent, or their level of understanding needs to be like taken a next step further. This is not to say that I think that I myself know all of these things, but I think it's safe to say that I know enough that I think it's unlikely that one component is going to just drive all of these problems and just move in this very reductionistic linear pathway, and that there's going to be multiple interlocking factors involved in this system. I think if you see, when you go through the health information enough, you're like, wow, this stuff is really integrated and there's a lot of things to know. And to just try to explain it to this one factor is like, I'll probably miss something if I come from that perspective.
Yeah. And again, if you're going to make the assumption that this is a problem for most people, or even for a significant portion of people, there should be some really solid evidence behind the fact that this can happen easily, commonly. It doesn't take high doses. These things are very clearly problematic. And that's obviously not what we're seeing here. And that's why we just wanted to spend some time digging into the most fundamental claims that would need to be really well supported in order for this to be something that someone bases not only a short-term 1 month experiment of their health on, but we're talking about years and years because of this idea that in order to recover from the toxicity, it's going to take years, and every little possible carotenoid that you're going to have exposure to is going to put you back however many months. I mean, it's just, I think we made it clear that the claims that we went through that are being made really don't hold any water and are very, very poorly supported or just not supported at all. And in fact, the evidence is strongly against those claims that are being made. And these are some of the foundations of the vitamin A toxicity paradigm. Obviously, it's not everything, but most of it, I think, beyond this is really not worth spending that much time going through. And we will be doing a follow-up series digging into some of the details, not just necessarily from the vitamin A toxicity perspective, but just looking into the intricacies of vitamin A and retinoid metabolism, benefits and possible negatives of excesses and negatives of deficiencies, and how much vitamin A we actually think somebody should be consuming, and what might predispose someone to vitamin A toxicity in that very rare case, and what to do about it other than just avoiding vitamin A and not considering other factors. Again, still with the knowledge in mind that that's probably going to be a very, very rare case. But we'll talk about all those situations in either regard. But we'll end the series there. And again, we'll have a follow-up series digging into some of those other things that I mentioned. But we'll leave it there. Mike, where can listeners find more of your work?
They can find me at my YouTube channel, Mike Fave, and they can also find me at my website, mikefave.com.
Perfect. All right. If you did enjoy this episode in this series, please leave a like or a comment if you're watching on YouTube. And if you're listening elsewhere, please leave a review or 5-star rating. All of those things really do a lot to help support the podcast and are very much appreciated. As always, to check out the show notes for today's episode, you can head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/podcast, where you can take a look at the links to articles, studies, or anything else that we've referenced throughout today's episode. And if you're dealing with any low energy symptoms, maybe you've been trying to resolve these with a low vitamin A diet. This could be issues like cravings and hunger, low energy or fatigue, chronic pain, weight gain, digestive symptoms, brain fog, poor sleep, hormonal imbalances, or various other chronic conditions like autoimmune issues, high blood pressure, insulin resistance, high cholesterol, or various others, then head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/energy to sign up for a free energy balance mini course. In this mini course, I'll walk you through how you can adjust your diet and lifestyle to maximize your cellular energy and resolve these low energy symptoms and conditions. So again, head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/energy to sign up for that free energy balance mini course. And with that, I'll see you on the next episode.